The chandeliers burned bright above the grand corporate gala, their golden glow bouncing across polished marble floors. Laughter spilled like champagne as executives clinked glasses, their conversations dripping with self-importance. At the edge of the stage, a janitor in a faded uniform lingered, his mop bucket pushed aside, his eyes drawn not to the wealth around him, but to the violin resting on its velvet stand. The CEO noticed. With a smirk sharp enough to cut glass, she raised her voice. "Careful," she mocked. "That's not a broom." A ripple of laughter swelled through the hall, cruel and careless. The janitor hesitated, then, almost against his own better judgment, reached out and lifted the instrument. The crowd leaned closer, hungry for a joke. More laughter echoed, bouncing harshly off the walls. But as the bow brushed against the strings, a hush crept in, heavy and unexpected. Something was about to shift. The hush that fell over the gala wasn't silence. It was disbelief waiting to break into ridicule. The janitor lowered the bow, fingers trembling. For a moment, even he wondered if he had made a mistake by touching something so out of place in his calloused hands. The CEO leaned back in her chair, wine glass in hand, her smirk unwavering. Around her, investors and board members exchanged amused glances, waiting for the punchline of a joke they thought they already knew. To them, he was invisible until now, an anonymous man who cleared their messes. His story, his life, his hands, none of it mattered. But inside the janitor, there was a pull stronger than fear. His father's face flickered in memory, an old man in a tiny apartment, coaxing melodies out of an aging violin long after his own hands had stiffened with age. Music had been their shared language, their only escape from poverty and loss. He adjusted the violin under his chin, clumsy at first, but his grip soon steadied. The laughter quieted into whispers. Why hadn't he set it down? Why did he look as though the instrument belonged to him? In the far corner, a waitress paused mid-step, tray balanced in one hand. A few guests shifted, curiosity softening the edges of their disdain. Still, the CEO's smile widened, convinced this was entertainment. A janitor foolish enough to play make believe in a hall that would never accept him. The janitor closed his eyes. He exhaled, and in that breath, the room changed for him. No chandeliers, no board members, no cruel eyes. Only the memory of his father's trembling bow and the echo of music that once filled a cramped, dimly lit kitchen. The bow touched the strings again. Not a squeak, not a fumbling note, but a tone pure and haunting, like the first word of a story long suppressed. The sound lingered in the hall, sharp as glass, fragile as breath. The smirks began to falter, whispers died. One note had broken through, and it was enough to make the audience lean in, their laughter caught in their throats. Something they hadn't expected was unfolding, something they could no longer laugh at. The first note still hung in the air when the second followed, soft, uncertain, like a secret daring to be spoken aloud. The janitor's hands shook, but each tremor bled into the strings, creating a rawness that silenced the room more effectively than any command ever could. At first, the crowd waited for the mistake. A sour note, a clumsy fumble, proof that he didn't belong. But instead, what came was a melody threaded with pain and memory, something far too fragile to fake. The CEO's smirk froze, her wine glass midway to her lips. She wasn't smiling anymore. The janitor's bow danced with growing confidence, pulling sound after sound from the violin. They weren't polished notes from a trained musician, but they carried weight, an ache that seeped past the gala's glittering walls. Each note told of nights spent alone with a child asleep in the next room, of bills unpaid, of dreams traded for survival. A young assistant in the back, no more than 20, felt his chest tighten. He'd played violin once as a boy, before life pulled him into filing reports and fetching coffee. Now, hearing this man pour his soul into music, he remembered the weight of a bow in his own hands. He wasn't the only one. The whispers that once mocked had turned into murmurs of awe. People leaned forward, not out of ridicule, but because they were afraid to miss a single moment. Even the waitstaff stood still, captivated by the story unfolding without words. The janitor's eyes flickered open briefly. He saw them, all of them, watching. For years he had blended into the background, unseen except when something needed cleaning. Now every gaze was fixed on him. And strangely, he wasn't afraid. He belonged to the music, and the music belonged to him. The melody shifted, softer now, almost tender, like a lullaby. Somewhere in the crowd, someone exhaled shakily. Another dabbed at their eyes with a napkin. The hall, moments ago brimming with arrogance and laughter, was being undone by a man they had dismissed. The CEO shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't entertainment. This was revelation. She set her glass down, her fingers tight around the stem, and for the first time in years, she had no clever words, no mocking retort. She simply listened, and the janitor played on, each note a confession, each phrase a defiance. He wasn't asking for their approval. He was telling them a truth they could no longer ignore. By the time he reached the crescendo, the hall had forgotten itself. The chandeliers, the marble, the champagne. It all dissolved into silence, save for the trembling cry of strings that seemed to pull at the very bones of those who listened. For a moment, the entire room was his. The janitor drew out the final note, holding it until the last vibration melted into stillness. He lowered the bow, chest rising and falling, his face damp with sweat. And then silence. Not the cruel silence of mockery, not the awkward silence of waiting for failure, but a silence so thick, so reverent, that no one dared break it. The hall, once filled with laughter, now belonged to the man they had tried to make invisible. Something had shifted, and none of them, not even the CEO, could deny it. The applause didn't come. Not yet. The silence stretched, heavy, as though the hall itself refused to breathe. The janitor lowered the violin slowly, almost apologetically, as if ashamed of having taken up so much space. He set the bow on the stand and bowed his head, ready to slip back into the shadows where he had always been kept. Then one clap, a hesitant sound from the far corner. It wasn't the CEO. It wasn't the board members. It was the assistant, the same young man who'd once played as a boy. His hands trembled, but he clapped again, louder this time, and like a spark in dry grass, the hall erupted. Applause thundered, rising and falling in waves. The janitor's eyes darted across the room in disbelief. Applause. For him. The CEO's lips parted, as though she meant to protest, but no words came. Her smirk had vanished, replaced by something she couldn't disguise. Unease. Because she, of all people, suddenly realized. This man had lived through battles her world had never even glimpsed. "Tell us," someone called, a voice from the board table. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The janitor hesitated, clutching the violin to his chest. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the echoes of applause. "My father," he said at last. "He taught me when I was a boy. Music was our way of speaking when words failed. He worked the fields, came home with hands too cracked to even hold a bow. But he taught me anyway." The hall leaned in, spellbound. He glanced down at the strings, his thumb brushing against them. "When he passed, I sold the violin to pay the bills. Years later, I found this one in a pawn shop. Cheap, scratched, barely playable. But it was all I could afford. Nights after cleaning shifts, I'd play it. Not for anyone, just to remember him. To remind myself I still had something left." His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "I had a wife once," he added quietly. A murmur swept through the room. "We dreamed of a little house, of teaching our kids music too. But life doesn't always give you what you dream. She got sick. Hospital bills piled up. And when she was gone, it was just me and my daughter. This violin. It's the only way I knew how to keep her spirit alive for our child." Gasps rippled through the audience. The same men and women who'd once dismissed him as a nobody now sat riveted, their champagne untouched, their laughter forgotten. The janitor's shoulders slumped, as though confessing had cost him everything. "So, when I touched this violin tonight, I wasn't trying to mock anyone. I wasn't trying to take the stage. I just wanted to remember, for a moment, and maybe show my little girl that even if the world forgets you, your music doesn't have to." The room was no longer the same. Executives who prided themselves on numbers and profit suddenly found themselves blinking back tears. The assistant who had clapped first wiped his eyes openly. Even the CEO, regal in her gown, had gone pale. She tried to shift the spotlight back, but the truth was too strong. Everyone had felt it. The ache, the sacrifice, the stubborn hope inside the janitor's music. The violin, scratched and scarred as it was, had told the story of a man who had lost almost everything, but refused to lose his humanity. And now the hall knew his story too. The janitor lowered his gaze, his voice barely audible. "That's all. I'll get back to my work now." He turned, intent on leaving, the violin still cradled like a fragile piece of his heart. But no one moved. No one let him go, because something inside that grand hall had shifted forever. The janitor's last words still lingered in the air, fragile and haunting, when he turned to leave. His shoes made the faintest squeak against the polished marble floor, echoing far too loudly in the silence. But no one in the hall reached for their champagne again. No one turned away. It was the CEO, immaculate, untouchable, poised like royalty, who finally broke the spell. "Wait," she said. The janitor froze. He half expected mockery again, some cutting remark to restore the hierarchy of the night. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned back. The CEO's voice faltered, softer now, no longer laced with ridicule. What was the piece you played?" His brows furrowed. "It wasn't a piece," he admitted. "It was mine. Bits of songs my father hummed, parts one made up over the years. Just fragments stitched together. Nothing official." The words landed like a thunderclap. The same hall that had laughed at him minutes earlier now sat stunned, realizing the music that had silenced them hadn't even belonged to Beethoven or Bach. It had been born in the quiet corners of a janitor's grief. The CEO's lips parted slightly. For once, she had no quip, no weaponized charm to hide behind. The assistant at her side whispered, "Ma'am, do you realize what this means?" But she ignored him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the janitor, her expression unreadable. In her chest, pride and discomfort wrestled violently. All her life, she had measured worth by titles, appearances, by the cold ledger of wins and losses. And here stood a man she had dismissed with a single laugh. A man who had just revealed a soul deeper than anyone else in the room. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in control. The janitor shifted uneasily, misinterpreting her silence. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I didn't mean to disrupt anything." He made another attempt to leave, but the board members stirred, their voices rising. "Overstepped? That was brilliant. Remarkable. Untrained. And yet, do you know what we just witnessed?" Compliments swirled around the hall, directed at him, not her. The CEO's hands tightened on her wine glass. For years, every room had revolved around her presence. But now the axis had shifted. All eyes, hungry, respectful, reverent, were on the janitor. Her smile twitched, forced. She raised her chin, but the sound of genuine admiration in their voices pierced her carefully constructed armor. And that's when she felt it. A sting, sharp and unwelcome. Not jealousy, though it was close. It was something more dangerous. Humility. She couldn't stop replaying the melody in her mind. The way it carried sorrow and strength in the same breath. The way the room had bowed unconsciously to its power. She had built an empire on commanding rooms with speeches, deals, and power plays. But this man, this janitor, had commanded one with nothing but music born of memory. The realization rattled her. Her voice wavered. "Play again," she said suddenly. The demand came out sharper than she intended, and several guests raised their brows at her tone. The janitor blinked. I really should get back to work." But the room wasn't ready to let him go. And neither was she, because deep inside, the CEO knew the truth. She had laughed at him once, and it had nearly cost her the respect of the very people she sought to impress. If she let him walk out now, she might never reclaim the ground she had lost. And worse, she might never silence the quiet, uncomfortable truth gnawing at her. That perhaps she had just met someone richer in spirit than she could ever hope to be. The janitor's hands twitched nervously, his gaze dropping to the polished floor. "Really?" he murmured, his voice steady but edged with unease. "I should be cleaning up, not this." The violin dangled awkwardly at his side, as if it weighed far more than it should. But the crowd didn't agree. A few of the guests leaned forward in their seats, unwilling to let him vanish into anonymity again. A board member called out, "You can't just leave us with a single taste. Please, play more." "Yes, please," another added, a woman with eyes still shimmering from unshed tears. That wasn't just music. It was something else. Healing. The room hummed with agreement, but the janitor only shook his head. His jaw tightened. "I'm not an entertainer. I'm not here for that." The silence that followed was different now, no longer dismissive, no longer mocking. It was charged, fragile, as though the entire hall balanced on the edge of his decision. The CEO's carefully constructed smile wavered. She couldn't bear the thought of losing control again, not so soon after he had stolen the room. She stepped forward, her heels clicking like a gavel. "You just silenced 100 people with a song no one knew existed. Don't pretend that doesn't mean something." Her voice carried the authority of command, but beneath it, a faint tremor betrayed something more complicated: need. The janitor met her eyes at last. His gaze was steady, almost defiant. "Do you know what it costs to play like that? Do you know what I have to remember every time I put out a string?" His words landed with unexpected weight. The room shifted uneasily. Guests glanced at each other, sensing a story they hadn't been invited to know. The CEO blinked, caught off guard. For a heartbeat, she felt exposed, as though he wasn't just speaking about himself but reflecting something back at her. A truth she wasn't ready to face. Still, she pressed forward. Pride had never let her back down. "Then let us pay the cost with you," she said, her tone a careful balance of challenge and plea. "One more song. That's all we ask." The janitor's grip tightened around the violin. His knuckles whitened, and then he shook his head again. "No." Gasps rippled across the hall. No one had ever told the CEO no in public. For the first time in years, she found herself powerless, standing in front of a man who should have been invisible, yet held the entire room in his silence. The tension thickened, a storm waiting to break, and somewhere in that charged stillness, the janitor whispered, almost to himself, "Some music isn't meant to be performed. It's meant to be lived." The words stunned them all. The hall wasn't just waiting for a performance anymore. It was waiting for the truth behind the music, a truth that would demand to be heard. The janitor stood frozen at the center of the grand hall, violin pressed against his chest like a shield. The audience waited, silent, restless, expectant. But inside him, a different concert played. The smell of floor polish faded. The shimmer of crystal chandeliers blurred. And suddenly, he wasn't standing in the CEO's gala at all. He was back in a dimly lit apartment, the wallpaper peeling, the sound of laughter echoing in rooms too small for dreams. His daughter's laughter. She had been 8, bright-eyed, wild-haired, and fearless. A violin almost too big for her small frame rested under her chin. He remembered how she used to grip it awkwardly, how her bow scratched and squeaked at first, but she would giggle through every mistake, insisting, "One day, Daddy, I'll make it sing." He swallowed hard. The crowd couldn't see it, but every note he'd played earlier had been hers, not his. Her melody, her stubbornness, her dream. He'd been a janitor long before the gala, long before this night. But once, years ago, he'd been something else. A father fighting to keep his little girl's fire alive. He worked double shifts, patched his shoes with tape, skipped meals just to pay for her music lessons. Every scraped knee and every broken string, he carried it with her. Until the sickness came, his throat tightened. He could still hear the hospital monitors, the endless hum of machines. The way her bow fell silent because her hands trembled too much to hold it anymore. She had whispered, voice thin as paper. "Play for me, Daddy. When I can't anymore, play," he had promised. But the day she slipped away, the violin went silent too. He packed it away in its case, buried it under years of dust and heartbreak. For years, he couldn't touch it without breaking. Music was too sharp, too cruel. It cut him open with every note. And yet, here he was holding it again. Not because he wanted to, because the world had cornered him into remembering. Back in the hall, the CEO's eyes narrowed. She sensed it. The weight behind his refusal wasn't arrogance. It was grief. She softened, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was someone you lost, wasn't it?" His gaze flicked to her, startled. For a moment, the mask slipped, and the audience glimpsed the raw ache in his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. The room seemed to exhale as one, but no one dared to speak. The grandeur of the gala had crumbled into something intimate, fragile. 100 strangers gathered in the shadow of one man's story. The janitor ran his thumb along the worn edge of the violin, where faint scratches still remained, the ones his daughter's clumsy bow had left behind. "This instrument doesn't belong to me," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "It belongs to someone who isn't here anymore. Every note you heard, it wasn't mine. It was hers." A ripple of emotion swept across the hall. Some guests looked down, unable to meet his eyes, while others wiped tears openly. The CEO's jaw clenched, but not in defiance this time. In recognition, she knew the sharpness of loss, though she buried it behind power and wealth. The janitor's shoulders sagged under the weight of memory. "So, forgive me if I don't want to play again. Playing means remembering, and remembering hurts." He placed the violin gently on the nearest table, as if returning it to a ghost. For a long moment, no one moved. The hall wasn't a hall anymore. It was a confessional, a sanctuary where grief had finally been spoken aloud. And in that silence, the janitor finally breathed. For the first time in years, he had shared her story. Not as a performance, not as entertainment, but as truth. The violin rested silently on the table, its wooden body catching the light of the chandeliers. No one in the hall dared to move. Even the waiters, frozen mid-step, seemed unwilling to disturb the fragile air. The janitor stood beside it, breathing unevenly, as though every confession had stolen a piece of his strength. His story hung in the air like an unfinished note, vibrating in every corner of the room. At the far end of the hall, the CEO rose from her chair. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound startling after so much silence. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, her eyes fixed not on the violin but on the man who had just stripped his soul bare before hundreds. When she stopped in front of him, the room seemed to lean in. Her voice was softer now, stripped of mockery. "I laughed," she admitted, her words trembling with something uncharacteristic, regret. "When you touched that violin, I laughed, because I thought you were a man reaching for something that didn't belong to you." The janitor kept his gaze on the floor. "But I was wrong." She glanced at the violin, then back at him. "You weren't reaching for something above you. You were holding on to something you'd already lost. And that takes more courage than most of us will ever know." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Wealthy patrons, powerful figures who had laughed along with her earlier, now found themselves cornered by the mirror she held up. The janitor said nothing. His silence was its own language. So the CEO did something no one expected. She reached for the violin. Her manicured fingers trembled as she picked it up, holding it with the reverence of someone cradling a relic. She looked at him, her eyes no longer sharp with power but softened with something almost childlike. "I don't know how to play," she said, "but I do know what it's like to lose." The words caught him off guard. For the first time since the gala began, he looked her in the eye. And there it was, beneath her diamonds and silk, the faint echo of a wound she carried but never spoke of. "My father," she confessed quietly, her voice barely reaching him but somehow filling the hall. "He wanted me to play piano. He said music was the only language that could outlast grief. But when he passed, I shut it all out. I buried it, just like you buried this violin." The hall stilled. Two stories, different lives, different losses, now mirrored each other under the same roof. She set the violin back down gently, as though placing it on sacred ground. "Maybe," she whispered, "neither of us was supposed to carry this pain alone." A murmur rippled through the audience. For the first time, their admiration wasn't for the CEO's authority or the janitor's defiance. It was for the fragile bridge forming between them. The janitor's hands shook slightly as he reached toward the violin once more, his fingertips brushing against its polished surface. Not to claim it, but to acknowledge it. Her voice steadied. "Don't let her music end here. Play not because it hurts, but because it heals." For a long moment, his chest heaved, torn between resistance and surrender. Then, slowly, he lifted the violin again. This time, the hall wasn't laughing. It was holding its breath. The bow hovered in the janitor's trembling hand. He hadn't touched it like this in years, his fingers awkward, clumsy, as though grief had turned them to stone. But when the wood brushed the strings, a faint hum rose, fragile and searching. The audience leaned in, not because they expected beauty, but because they expected failure. And then he played. The first note rang sharp, raw, unpolished. It wasn't the smooth perfection of a trained concert violinist, but something else entirely. Something wounded, something human. The sound clawed at the air like a voice breaking through chains. The janitor's shoulders shook. His bow dragged with desperation. Each stroke pulled straight from his chest. The melody wasn't flawless. It cracked, it faltered, but inside the cracks poured something purer than perfection. Pain, memory, love. The hall went silent. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was now a ghost, banished by a single vibrating string. People stared, their champagne glasses frozen mid-air, tears welling without permission. He closed his eyes, and the violin carried him back. He wasn't in the grand hall anymore. He was in a cramped living room with peeling wallpaper, where his daughter sat cross-legged on the carpet, clapping along to his playing. He could hear her voice, soft but clear, whispering, "Again, Daddy, play again." And so he did. The melody swelled, stretching beyond its broken edges, filling every corner of the hall with a sound that didn't just enter ears. It carved into hearts. Somewhere near the front, a woman covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Beside her, a man dropped his head into his hands, shoulders heaving. Even the waiters, stoic, trained to serve invisibly, stood motionless, eyes shining. The CEO had not sat down. She stood at the center of it all, her arms folded across her chest, not in judgment, but in a vain attempt to hold herself together. Her jaw trembled. Each note seemed to peel away a layer of armor she had worn for years. The janitor shifted, moving the bow with greater urgency now. The music rose, not in polished scales, but in waves, like grief itself, crashing, receding, and returning again with relentless force. It was not just a performance. It was a confession. Every lost opportunity, every humiliation endured, every long night of cleaning offices where no one said his name. All of it lived in the rise and fall of those strings. And then it changed. From sorrow, the notes turned gentler, softer, a lullaby. He was playing for her again, for the little girl who once believed her father could pull magic out of wood and horsehair. For the nights when she leaned against his chest, drifting into dreams as the violin sang her to sleep. In that instant, the hall was no longer a hall. It was a child's bedroom. It was a funeral. It was every broken heart stitched together by sound. The audience, once dressed in arrogance and champagne, was now stripped to their simplest selves. Human beings, fragile and aching. And when the melody finally began to fall, descending into its last few notes, the silence grew heavier, preparing itself for the absence that was about to come. The bow lifted. One last vibration quivered in the air, fading slowly until the hall was left with nothing but the sound of its own heartbeat. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, applause did not erupt. Not yet. Instead, tears did. Quiet sobs filled the corners. The CEO pressed her hands to her lips, her mascara streaking. Somewhere in the back, a man whispered, "My God!" The janitor lowered the violin. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as though he had run miles. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply held the instrument to his chest like a father holding a child. The CEO stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble again. She stopped in front of him, her voice breaking in a way no boardroom had ever heard before. "You've done tonight," she whispered. "What none of us could ever buy." Her words weren't for the audience. They were for him, for the man who had turned grief into a sermon. This time, when the applause finally erupted, it wasn't polite. It wasn't obligatory. It was desperate, thunderous, unstoppable. Hundreds of hands clapping not for a janitor, not for a CEO, but for the truth that had been ripped open inside them all. The janitor stood still, letting it wash over him. His eyes glistened, but he didn't break. And in that roaring storm of claps, cheers, and tears, one thing was certain. The hall would never forget the night when silence fell, and music rose from the ashes of laughter. The applause thundered on, but the janitor didn't move. His fingers still rested lightly on the violin, the way one might linger with the hand of someone they've just lost. Half afraid to let go, half grateful for having touched them at all. Eventually, the ovations softened into silence. It wasn't the heavy silence of mockery anymore, but something else. Reverence. The CEO stood close, her usual poise nowhere to be found. Instead of commanding, she looked humbled. Her eyes were red, her voice uneven. "Will you?" She stopped, swallowed, and began again. "Would you play again? Not for them. For me." The janitor studied her face, searching for the sneer he'd heard earlier, the casual dismissal of his worth. But it wasn't there anymore. Only honesty, only need. He gave a faint nod. "Not tonight," he said softly. "Music like this, it only comes once." The words struck deeper than any note. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the entire hall holding its breath around them. Then, almost shyly, the CEO extended her hand, not as a gesture of power, but of respect. When he shook it, something in the room shifted. Those who had laughed earlier, executives, socialites, wealthy donors, looked away, ashamed of their own part in the humiliation. They had witnessed not just a performance, but their own reflection. The janitor tucked the violin gently back into its case. He turned toward the door, his steps unhurried. And as he walked, the crowd parted like water, making way for a man they had never truly seen until now. The CEO followed him with her eyes, as though afraid that if she looked away, the lesson might vanish. She whispered, mostly to herself, "Greatness isn't always on the stage. Sometimes, it's sweeping it." The gala ended, but the story didn't. In the days that followed, word spread. Not about the charity auction, not about the expensive gowns or the champagne towers, but about the janitor. The man with a violin who had silenced a hall full of power with nothing but truth. For weeks, strangers whispered his story in elevators, over dinners, in offices. He became a quiet legend, not because he sought it, but because authenticity cannot be ignored. The CEO, too, was changed. No press release could capture it, but those close to her noticed. She interrupted less, listened more. In meetings, she began to ask questions that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with people. What are they going through? Who are we not seeing? It wasn't overnight, but slowly, the sharp edges of her leadership softened into something far rarer, empathy. And the janitor? He returned to his quiet routines. Floors still needed mopping, bins still needed emptying. He never sought the spotlight, never capitalized on the moment. But once in a while, when the halls were empty and the lights dimmed low, he would take the violin from its case. Not to perform, not to prove, but to remember. To remember that in a world obsessed with titles and wealth, it only takes one soul, one story, one song, to remind us of what truly matters.